And we are recording. All right, Mr. Boobles, kick us off, man.
All right, so this week we have Esther Derby on the podcast, and I barely feel like I need to give Esther a introduction because I don't know. I've been following Esther for so long and talking about her work, and so it's just awesome to have this conversation with you, Esther. So and finally meet you.
I'm
Um,
really happy to be here.
Thanks. So we were kind of talking before recording, just starting with organizational change and like how do we bring organizational change? So like, what do you think of like someone's like, hey, can you come in and change my organization or help me with this agile thing? Well, where do you start?
Well, I start by trying to figure out why they want to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Because I get calls from people who just, it's like, well, we need to do the agile. And I try to understand what they are hoping to change, what they hope will be different, what they hope, what problems they hope to solve, and what benefit they hope to create. Because if they just want to do the agile, it's often a very superficial sort of change.
Right. Yeah, it's not just a checkbox thing. Like, let's figure out what we really are optimizing for and what changes we need to make.
Yeah.
So is it generally starting then with like leadership? Is that usually where you enter when it comes to a change?
It really depends. And I think you have to work on multiple levels. I mean, you have to work on the team level. You have to work on the sort of system level. So getting middle managers to work across the system to look at how work is flowing through their organization. That's a big thing that often doesn't get much attention.
Mm-hmm.
And then, eventually you have to look at how the overall sort of ethos of the company is playing out. Because otherwise it tends to hit this sort of barrier. And it's really odd because in terms of the benefits of Agile, which is incremental value delivery and realizing value earlier, people in the C-suite get that and they want that. But it very often takes their participation to change some of the organizational systems that get in the way of that.
Yeah.
But you can start anywhere. I mean, there's no perfect place to start. You start where you can.
Yeah. In my experience, when I've been a part of changes earlier in my career, when we try to do more of a shotgun approach where it's like, let's start the change everywhere, that hasn't worked so well for me. And so what I found to work really well is deep and narrow. It's like, let's pick one product, one holistic product, something we sell to the market, and let's focus there in one area and kind of create an org within an org and then build it up from there. Do you do something similar, or what has your experience been?
Well, I think that's a great way to start. I mean, I think the idea that you have to change everything all at once, or you have to train 20 teams, or you have to roll it out is, well, I mean, a lot of people have that idea, but it's actually not accurate. And I think doing one product area or even one team, you can learn a lot about what the barriers are going to be in the rest of the organization. And that's useful because then you can start working on those.
Right. Yeah, that's great.
So when you're thinking about, because something you were just saying made me think about one of the common missteps I see in organizations, especially when I'm teaching students. I often articulate, and let's take Scrum because that's kind of the specialty area that I train to, is why even bother with this Scrum stuff? And for me, I try to visualize is it's minimizing your time to market, maximizing your value output that you're going to get. But just like you were saying before, that made me think about this was that necessitating change in how leaders lead. Very often it's out of the box. If you just put Scrum in place, you're going to get that minimization of time to market, right? You get an increment every 2 weeks, every 4 weeks, whatever that happens to be. Well, I guess you should, if you're doing it properly, right? You create an increment, you're delivering it to a customer. You should be minimizing that time to market. So instead of waiting 6 months, 12 months, whatever that happened to be for big batch delivery going out, boom, you get that out of the box with Scrum if you're doing it appropriately. But the other side of that, the responding to change part or the maximizing value position of that, so often I see teams that, we're utilizing Scrum now, but we've got our yearly roadmap already planned out. So it's not like you can't maximize value in that situation because it's not the value. The goal isn't maximizing value. The goal is following the plan, right? And every
Mhm.
year in our annual budgeting process, when we're coming up with a laundry list of stuff that we need to do, great, that's set in stone. And now we just hand it to the teams and we say, execute to that. So I'm curious, when you were talking about the change in
Mhm.
leadership, being more involved, et cetera, is part of that opening up and allowing more autonomy down to the teams, the part of the change that you're talking about? Or is it something completely different that you're seeing where they're not so open to changing?
Well, I think it's a both and. I think, there are very often organizational systems that actually do get in the way of delivering incrementally every 2 weeks. I mean, I've run into companies where their CapEx and OpEx accounting methods ground everything to a halt,
Mm-hmm.
right? And somebody at the team level can't change that.
Right.
Yep.
Right. And they get all locked up in that, or it's their annual budgeting, along with their annual planning. So I think from that standpoint, you have to have leadership involved, and they need to are able to articulate the why. Because if they can't give people a reason why they should leave home, people don't understand why they should give up a comfortable way of working that has made the company successful up until now.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, I think that a lot of times it comes down to like, well, what are you optimizing for? Like from a leadership standpoint, is it control and compliance, or is it innovation? Is it responding to change? Is it empowerment? If those are the things you're looking for, then
Mhm.
we need to work a little differently, right? And so I think
Absolutely.
that's where that conversation starts.
Yeah. Well, a long time ago, I was helping implement Scrum at a company, and I talked to the senior vice president about needing to articulate why they wanted to actually make this change and what the benefit was. And I suggested that he talk to the teams about that because they really needed to understand why it was important, and particularly the middle managers, because they felt like they were losing out big time. And his answer was, well, we need to have 6 Scrum teams by June because it's my birthday, and 12 more by Christmas for my Christmas present. Right. So it's super important for the leaders to be involved from that aspect to articulate the change, particularly when you want to go beyond just, well, we're going to try this with a couple teams.
Mhm.
So you had said something interesting in there. The middle managers feel like they're missing out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious, is that valid? Do you think that's I don't want to say ignorance, but like, do you think that's a valid concern?
Of course. Of course. I mean, early on in Scrum, there were people saying, well, we don't need no stinking managers, so
Mhm.
of course, middle managers are uncomfortable when they hear people talking that way. I mean, they stand to lose a lot. And in a lot of organizations, when I talk to the middle managers, they get a lot of meaning from problem solving and directing their teams and moving people around to solve particular problems. And their focus in many organizations tends to be downward towards the team and then upwards towards the people they report to. And if you take that relationship with the team out, you change that dramatically. They're no longer doing day-to-day task supervision. How do they tell their managers above that they're doing anything valuable? Right. So of course they freak out.
Mhm. So what's your approach to working with those middle managers to help them find comfort in a new way of working?
Well, one thing I do is I start by having the managers start working with each other on problems that go across the organization. Because in many, many organizations, the middle managers are kind of siloed and isolated and often in competition with each other.
Mhm.
So I get them working on some cross organization projects, which build some relationships and show some value.
So do you do that
Yeah.
do you create some shared goals, or is there a particular method that you use to
Well,
do that if you do it?
it sort of depends on what's going on in the organization. Very often, after a few iterations, people will find that there are problems that are being experienced by multiple teams, right? And these tend to be organizational issues. So those are some things that the managers can work on.
Mhm.
And in the end, it's a far more strategic role when middle managers are working on enabling smooth flow of work and enhancing the system than doing task direction, right? Develop people, work on the system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just reading Jacko Williams' new book where he talks about like how when he's in the Navy SEALs, like as a leader, he had to step back from being, when he was, just a team member, being able to step back and like see the whole picture was like a big thing for him. And that's a huge transition for a leader. And I think that's exactly what you're talking about here. Like as a leader, your job is to stand back and like view the whole thing because you have a perspective that nobody else will have, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, and very often, if you're in an organization that is moving out of waterfall into something more agile, their focus has not even been on the team; it's been on individuals, right? So step back, look at the team, then step back and look at least your part of the organization, and try to figure out how are things working here? What are the blocks that are in the way of all of us?
Yeah, I like that stepping back and looking at the whole team. Like that's the first step. But then the next step, I think, is like stand back and look at like what's the whole product that we deliver to the customer,
right?
Or customer experience, whatever term you want to use. But really, that thing that we're delivering for value, and then how do we align around that? I think is that next step, because you're right. Like it's amazing in 2020 that we still have people that are very, very focused on the individual, and they're like 3, 4, 5 steps removed from the customer, and they have no idea how that value gets propagated up to the customers.
Right. That's, still it's surprising and yet not.
Yeah.
I mean, it comes out of this idea that, organizations are just machines, and that metaphor is really deeply embedded. And so, that leads to thinking about people who are little cogs. And if you give them their specifications, they will do their little job and then it will all fit together. So in some ways it's not surprising. And in the other way, it's like, whoa. How can we expect anybody to build products that delight their customers if they don't know who their customers are?
Right.
Yeah, it's funny that you bring that up. We were literally just talking about this this week of like, so our product at Health Champion is right now the primary one is COVID tracking, and so that wasn't originally what we were planning on doing, but we had built a platform that fit really nicely. So once the pandemic hit, there was kind of a larger pivot at the organization. We created this COVID tracking tool, got it out there, and now all of a sudden it is out there, and we've got lots of customers coming onto the platform, which is a great thing. But we were literally just talking last week. We've got our customer success team that is dealing with all the issues that are coming in, and that's really great that they're focused on it. But it was like, hey, why isn't our development team being a little bit more in tune with this? Literally in our last retrospective, it was like, hey, maybe we should start cycling people through. Maybe members of the development team should, on a weekly basis or whatever that happens to be, we should actually be pulling in customer support tickets so that we're having that constant conversation with our customers, understanding the frustrations that they're dealing with, et cetera. So I just found that kind of interesting. I know we've talked with I think of the Liberators in the past, and they're thinking about the bureaucratic index and how many layers that you're putting in between your development team and your actual development team, or excuse me, the development team and your customers, et cetera. And just the more layers that you're putting inside of there, I would just expect bad things to kind of happen from that. Expect to be disconnected from your customers and not be thinking about your customers and being empathetic to your customers, et cetera.
I really love that idea of having people cycle through support. I mean, the people in support have a vast amount of knowledge about how people struggle with the product. Right. So I think I love that idea.
Yeah. There's one product team I worked with where there was 5 teams working under one product, one product backlog. And what they did is they had support rotate between each of the 5 teams each sprint. So once every 5 sprints, you would get to do support, and you were the main support team, and you would take on way less features when you were the team that was doing support. And I thought that worked pretty well because everybody was accountable. If you put out some things that didn't satisfy a need or had a lot of issues, well, you're going to get that back, and you're going to get that 3 a.m. phone call that says, hey, now we have to fix this problem. And so I thought they could added a whole nother level of accountability for the development teams having that, and let them understand their customers, much deeper.
Yeah, it's real eye-opening for many people, or actually meeting the customer if that's possible.
Right.
Yeah. I was just going to add on to this, especially being in that product owner position where you're looking at the run rate of your team and you're looking at the run rate of the support team. And generally there's a little bit of a difference there. And so I know that the pushback would be like, well, why would we pay software engineers that are making, $300 an hour or whatever that rate happens to be. But we've got our customer support team, there's a lot more lower finances there or expenditure there. But I think people overlook, again, the understanding of your customer. The more your development team can understand your customer, the better the product they're going to develop for their customer, the more they're going to understand them. And all of a sudden, the back and forth that exists because they put something kind of not so great out there the first time, well, now they built it better the first time because they started with their customer in mind. So yeah, they do cost more every hour. Typically, a software developer is going to have a higher cost to it, but you don't. I would say sometimes product owners don't think about the back and forth and the actual time and cost savings that you're going to get out of that when you continually keep your customer front and center. And what are the ways that you can kind of reinforce that with your development team? So, I mean, I'm excited about it. I hope they are excited about it, but we'll see what happens here.
Well, it's one of these things that often gets in the way of change, is that people focus on stuff that's easy to count. Labor rate is easy to count.
Mm-hmm.
But the benefit of people understanding how their customers use the product, what their customers' lives are, what kind of problems the product solves, what kind of problems it creates, that's harder to put a value on. It's not impossible. You can get some subjective sense of it, but that's harder to count. And so people focus on the stuff that's easy to count. And that is a huge issue with change, right? Because there are often many hard to count benefits. And if people are just focused on the dollars, they miss those. And everything can be brought down to dollars eventually. You just have to be kind of creative in how you do it.
Mm-hmm.
Another way to look at it is like, you could go out and do a bunch of user interviews and collect a bunch of analytics and do a bunch of reporting and try to figure out what the users are doing, but you're not getting paid anything for that learning. Learning is a first-class citizen now, right? But you're getting paid by the customer for support, or at least there's some compensation. Like, it's going to cost you something to provide the support. You've already signed up for that. So it's kind of like, you don't think about it, you're trying to make money on this. You're just trying to learn. And so if you're getting paid a little bit of money to learn, like, there's a benefit there. What are your thoughts?
It just seems odd to me that anyone would think user research didn't have enormous value. My mind boggles at that idea.
Well, I think the big pushback that I often get is, we know what our customers want.
Mm-hmm.
We just need to hurry up and build it and put it in front of our customers, because we've already. Sorry, I can already feel myself going into a negative route with this conversation. But I feel like that's the inside out, the assumption part of this. Sorry, go ahead, Esther.
Well, because my mind always goes to counterexample. That's what it does. It's just what it does. Sometimes it's super annoying. But there are, if you're trying to come up with something truly innovative, then maybe you don't want to go out and talk to your customers about, what they're doing in detail and ask them what they want, because they'll just tell you they want a better whatever it is they have now.
Mm-hmm.
So there are cases where, truly innovative ideas, maybe do happen in-house, informed by understanding what problems the customers are having, and maybe they haven't recognized a problem yet.
Yeah, there's this book I recently read. I'm trying to remember which one it was, but they were talking about 3 different levels in your product. Like, there's a transform, where it's like, that's that innovation you're talking about, Esther, where it's like, in that area, we probably need to know the problem, but we're going to figure out how to solve it for you. Then there's like the sustain. It's like, okay, we have this paper product and we need to make it digital, or, we do mailing marketing, but now we need to make it digital and your social media and stuff like that. That's a whole new avenue, but it's the same product. We just need to transform it with a new market or something. And then there's like efficiency type stuff, where it's like, we just need to make our current processes better. And so on those ones, you're definitely listening to your customers and getting some direct feedback, right? And they're going to have a lot of answers. Maybe on that transform one, it's like, well, we hear your problem, but we're going to try to solve it in a different way that's going to, that you just can't think of because you don't have the perspective we have by looking at the whole entire market.
Yeah. A friend of mine used to describe it as the Febreze problem, right? Because people whose curtains smell bad don't realize their curtains smell bad, right?
Yeah.
But sometimes you can come up with something really creative, and once that is introduced, then people recognize that there is some
And when you are taking
wonderful.
that, yeah, when you are creating that creative thing, like there's a lot of risk behind that, right? So
Oh,
validating that early and
absolutely.
often with a real customer, like, is all that more important to do, right? So yeah, so if it's not the research, then it's like feedback loops. How do I accelerate my feedback loop in that, that transformation area?
Yeah, and sometimes it takes longer than you would think. You know, like I mean, I was just thinking about. I don't have my phone on me right now, but my first little handheld device was, I think, Newton, right? And those never took off. Those
Mm-hmm.
never took off, but they continued making, evolving it into what is, essentially ended up as phones, but
Mm-hmm.
they're little computers. Those computers have more power than the first computer I worked on.
Yeah, isn't that crazy to think about?
That's crazy.
Earlier you were talking about change, and Jeff, we
Yeah.
kind of kicked off some of this conversation about, hey, Esther, you're coming in the door, you're trying to, where do you start with? Out of curiosity, because this has been like one of those, silver bullet isn't the right word, but how do you measure your change? How do you measure that you're successful in an organization?
Um, that's an interesting question, and it depends on what the organization is trying to accomplish,
Okay.
and what my scope of influence is, because ultimately I can't change their organization, right? They have to change their organization, and sometimes people bring in all sorts of people to help them with the change, and then don't do anything that's been suggested. I mean, that happens. Sometimes I measure it just by, are people asking different questions?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because then, I may not have influence over all their processes, but I can have some influence over how people are thinking about the problems they're facing.
Yeah.
How do you guys measure?
I think, again, context definitely matters, and like what you're
Yeah.
doing. It could be something as like, our goal is to reduce cycle time. Like, it's taking a long time to get something through there. So like, how can you help us do that? Another one can, and it could be something as simple as like, hey, we don't work as a team. Like, we don't enjoy going to work. And so maybe then it's more like an engagement, like how engaged are your employees? And maybe the questions are a good answer. Sometimes we do surveys, different things like that. But I think it is, what is your optimizing goal? And, and it depends on the context of the situation. What do you think, Jeff?
The reason I asked the question is because thinking back to our days, Jeff and I, when we were Agile coaches in a specific area, there was always a lot of discussion around like, how do we measure that we're having a positive impact on our organization? And, I like what both of you are saying. We have to define what is the goal, and then we can start tracking to it.
Mhm.
I don't think we ever had a good goal around that. So I'm always curious what other consultants, other change agents are doing to kind of measure out there. I always think about it as I do a lot of weightlifting, and I've done a lot of it in my past. But like, if I wanted to go and see a personal trainer, that's one of the first things that they're going to do is sit down and say, well, what's your goal? Are you trying to lose weight? Are you trying to put on weight? Are you trying to increase
No.
your 1 rep max? Well, just saying, like, it totally depends on what that goal is, and then we can start to
Yeah.
come up with a plan to achieve it. But unless we have that first alignment on what we're getting after, um, I think that's where I always kind of struggled when I was in that consulting position, was I never really had a good, clear understanding of what the goal was for the organization. Was it more Scrum teams? Okay, well, we could do that. I don't know if that's necessarily what you're really after, but at least that's a starting point for us to have the conversation. So anyway, I was just kind of curious how you
Well,
approach
I
that.
mean, that goes back to what we started talking about is, what are they hoping to accomplish? Right. And too often people, in my opinion, have their goal is, well, we want, 25% of our teams to be agile, or we want, 45% of our projects to be agile or whatever it is. And that gets gamed so easily. So I tend to focus on something related to an outcome, but then you have to have steering signals along the way. I was just thinking about this morning. It's like going back to your gym metaphor. I mean, your ultimate goal might be, or your weightlifting metaphor might be, increasing the measurement of your biceps, or, being able to do, 80 billion pull-ups or whatever it is, right? But you have some outcome measure. But if you don't have steering signals along the way, it's really easy to make a huge investment and not get any payoff, or end up going down the wrong path or whatever. I mean, if you're working out, you're actually having changes on the cellular level after probably your first exercise session. People can measure that. Most of us don't, but so you have to have little signals like that. So you can tell you're making progress, that you're in the right direction. And I think those are super important, and they help me know along the way that we're moving in the right direction. Right. And there were, even if I'm not still there when they reach the outcome goal, I know that, at least while I was there, we were steering towards it.
Yeah, a lot of times when I'm working with clients, we figure out what that optimizing goal is, and that's a lagging indicator. Like that's going to be, down the road, we're going to realize that. But then it's like, well, what are our hypotheses on the leading indicators? And then we start talking about that. I think that's exactly what you're talking about. It's like, well, if we really want to be able to hit these revenue goals and we want this growth and X, Y, Z, what do we think is going to make that better? Okay, we think if we can deliver to our customers faster, we can learn faster. That's a hypothesis we have. Let's try it out. We don't think there's a lot of engaged people. So we think if they were engaged, we would have innovative, creative ideas, and a lot of other great things that happen to influence this goal. Cool. Well, let's run some experiments. Let's change some things to align to those leading indicators, and then, see what happens towards our lagging indicator, right?
Yeah. So those are good indicators. The other thing I often look at is I look at what holds the current pattern in place. Because a lot of organizations will say, well, we're going to implement Scrum. They're implementing on top of existing processes and existing practices that generate patterns of behavior and results in their organization. So I look at what's holding that pattern in place, what can we influence about that pattern, and what indicators might I observe or detect related to that. So outcome measures, then the measures you were talking about were, your hypothesis, and then how are we able to influence the underlying system?
And then you talk about like what you're going to take away as well. Like that's always a lot of times like, oh, we're going to add these events, we're going to do these things, and here's why we do them. What are you doing that kind of does something like this today? And do we still need those? Like, do you have that kind of conversation with people?
That often comes up with when we're talking about what holds the pattern in place. But that's a really great point, because change, people think about it as adding a new process or a new method or whatever. But yeah, sometimes taking stuff away, particularly constraints or policies that just shackle people. Yeah. That can be really important to take those away. So deconstraining things.
Can you, I'm curious about this. Can you give me an example of, one of these things that holds a pattern in place?
So this is a really one that I run into a lot, and it's a lot of people experience it. So people say, we want collaboration. We really want teamwork. But we have individual task assignments, we have individual reviews, we have individual rating, and people are put in competition with each other to get scarce bonuses. So that tends to hold the pattern of individual achievement in place.
Yep. Another one, we want highly effective teams, right? But we're going to do annually budget cycle, and we're going to reform these teams every single year. Right, like,
or even every month or so.
Yeah, we're gonna do resource planning, and we got to divide everybody up in quarters, something like that.
Yeah, that holds a pattern in place of not having teams that cohere and really deeply learn their customers, their product. Actually, that can grind a company to a halt, particularly a software company. Because when I learned this from Jessitron, that she had it in one of her talks, that When you are building a system, right, you are incrementally building a mental model of that as you go. So it's kind of downhill, right, invention. But if you're learning a new system, it's uphill. And it's much harder to create a mental model of an existing complex system than it is to build one incrementally, right? So if that system is changing while you're trying to learn it, it makes it much harder. And if you spend 3 months and then you're on another team learning a different code base, you're never going to become truly effective or productive, right? Because you're always in this state of, uphill analysis.
Yeah, that's a great point, right? Like, it's just not making it easy to know your customers, know the technology, know the people, know how to work best with people, right? That come up with your own norms. Like, it makes it, you put people in a pretty difficult situation.
But it looks efficient on paper.
Yeah. I don't know. We find that a lot. Like, I guess that's one of the things that's like, organizations a lot of times say they want efficiency, but and then they strive for efficiency at the local level instead of at the organizational level. And I think that's, if we were doing the simple work of like, we're just, cranking out milk jugs. I don't even really know how you make milk jugs, probably with mold injections and stuff like that. But that would be, we could just say, you do these steps and you get this outcome. It's not that way in knowledge work. And so I think, there's that misconception. I think you kind of touched on that earlier, where it's like, we just think people are cogs in the machine and you do these things and you get this output. Yeah. And that's just not the way it works in knowledge work.
Yeah, that metaphor of factory or machine, organization machine, has driven so much of how we think about unconsciously and how we design organizations. And we've got a big old hangover from that mechanistic thinking. And big old hangover.
And that leads to how we build our applications now, right? Like, architectures now are built off of that infrastructure. So it's really hard to go work with that database team. We're just going to sneak something in over here, build this a little different over here, and then we don't have to worry about them, and we can own our own thing. And really, it's like, well, now we're not sharing data. Now we have all these other, downstream effects, whatever. There's lots of things that can happen. But architectures are a lot of times driven by your organizational structure, which, I don't know, gets scary.
Yep.
So I do want to jump in here and talk about a little bit about your book. So I mentioned earlier, I haven't had a chance to read it yet. It will be added to my list. There we go. So 7 Rules for Positive Productive Change. So I think, well, at least for me, you're known, I don't mean to be a jerk when I say this, you're known as the retrospective lady, right? You wrote that really great book on retrospectives. So, I don't even know, maybe you've written more books in between there, but I was kind of curious, like, what was that journey from focusing on Agile retrospectives? That's what
retrospective lady.
Yeah. To now we're I don't mean to be a jerk when I say that, please. So what was that journey like, and what was the, why get into, or why did you go that direction with the book?
Well, I actually wrote a book before the retrospectives one. It's called Behind Closed Doors: Secrets of Great Management, which came out of my experience. And I co-wrote it with Johanna Rothman. So she also had a similar experience of being a programmer on Wednesday and a manager on Thursday. Right? And so how do you make that transition? So I never set out to become the retrospectives lady, but here I am. And I've always been interested in change. I think I learned that part of my job was change in my first programming job. Right. I overheard a conversation between the head of the CEO of the company, the owner of the company, and their chief estimator, who was appalled that he was going to have to use our program. And he didn't say it was inaccurate or, didn't work. It changed his job. His job had been, talking to the customers, talking to the guys on the shop floor, scratching out some estimates, doing his worksheets. And now he's going to be sitting in front of a computer and on the phone, and he hated that idea. So I've always been aware that as someone involved in software, or not always, but for a long time, been aware that my job may have involved programming, but it also involved changing people's work life and how they felt about it. So it's been an interest of mine for a long time. And retrospectives, if you look at them from a certain perspective, are integrally involved in change, right? It's about changing stuff on the team level and then influencing things in the broader organization.
So that makes a lot of sense. And I guess I feel a little bit stupid now having not thought about it. But like I always, even when I teach it, I say like the sprint retrospective, it's the Kaizen event of Scrum. It's the continuous improvement event. But inherently in that is the necessity to change. But I've never really thought about the retrospective as a change event versus the continuous improvement event. So that actually makes a whole lot of sense. So I'm glad I asked you a dumb question because now I have a different.
It wasn't a dumb question.
Well, and I would say even your first book, I actually went back and read that this last week behind closed doors because I hadn't read it before. And it really is about change, right? Like, how do you change an organization? Again, granted, it's phase gate approach, maybe that the storyline, right? Not an incremental, agile, that we're not talking about.
I wrote it a long time ago.
But that was a long time ago when you wrote that, So that was probably the norm, and that's why you wrote it that way. But there's a lot of good lessons in there of like, well, this is what's happening behind closed doors, and here's the why behind some of the stuff we just do intuitively within an agile team, right? Like, and so I kept drawing out those correlations as I was reading it this last week.
Well, it's I was talking to somebody about this the other day that Agile in some ways isn't new, right? I mean, there was a confluence of influences that happened that sort of enabled what became XP. But when I talked to Jerry Weinberg when he was still living, and when I think back to when I started programming, a lot of what we did looked a lot like Agile. We worked in small increments because when, 1,000 card deck is hard to debug. So you get something small working and you try the next thing. And, you do a lot of checking each other's code and checking each other's thinking. And, so there were a lot of things that we did that in a lot of ways resembled Agile.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's funny because Jeff and I were working with a team. Oh, this is a couple years ago now, and there were a couple older gentlemen, and we were explaining Scrum to them, and they're like, "So you just want us to go back to the way we worked when we came out of like college?" And it's like, yeah, just like that. That's kind of what we're talking about. So,
before waterfall was imposed because it fits a mechanistic model.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's funny. I chuckle every time you tell that story, Jeff, because I distinctly remember the gentleman that we were talking about when we had it, and they were first of all, they were all great people, but they had been around the block. They had been at this company longer than I had been alive, so they had seen some fads come through, and I distinctly remember them saying, I'm really bought into this because it's just like how we used to work before, all the negative stuff came through.
I love that story. I love that.
So yeah, tell us more about the book, Esther, the new one. Well, it's a year old, but tell us what are those 7 steps? How did you come to write this book?
Well, I was sitting around with a friend of mine, Don Gray, and talking about really what are the if we could distill what it takes to change an organization into a handful of things, what would they be? And we kind of brainstorm a bunch of things, and then I made it into a talk. It was 6 rules at the time, and then I kept thinking about them, and it ended up with 7. But it's not like a lot of change processes where they say, you take these steps. These are really closer to heuristics, which are, guides for problem solving, but no one would buy a book with heuristics on the cover. So it says rules. And that pisses some people off too. Oops, was I allowed to say that?
You can say whatever you want on this podcast.
So they're little guides to problem solving that you can pull out and look at and use at any stuck point in a change. So the first one, which I actually this one you might want to do in order, is start from congruence, which is balancing your needs, the needs of the other people involved in the change, and the needs of the whole organization. Which is a good rule to come back to all the time, right? Because very, very often people think about, I need to get this change done because my project is on this schedule. My change project is on this schedule. Or they think about the organizational context, which is, we have to, if they've actually thought about it, we have to increase revenues or whatever it is. But they don't necessarily think about what's going on for the teams that have to change, right? So this brings the focus back to who, what's going on for me, what's going on for the teams, what's going on for the whole organization. And when I talk to people about that, I very often find that it helps people understand how people are responding to change. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, getting that alignment on the why and what the effect of that is. Like, you can say it one time and it's never enough. You can say it 10 times. So you just got to keep over saying it again and again and again and keep going back to it, because I know we forget things. Like in our teams, we're used to the way we used to work. And so you just always have to be reminded of that. So I love that.
And then tie it to the day to day.
Yeah.
Because sometimes people have this big, vague idea off in the distance somewhere, but you need to say, well, and that's what it means for our day to day work, right? So that's one of the rules.
I'll tell a quick little story. I think you'll think this is funny. So a friend of ours, Chad Beyer, we were working at this client together, and he would go every day and he would stand in front of the wall next to the values of the organization, and he'd sit there and read them. And they had a bunch of them. And people walk by and be like, Chad, what are you doing? He's like, I'm just absorbing the values so I can help people remember the why this organization exists. And they're like, that's kind of weird. But then he would go and bring it up in these meetings, like, oh, how are we living this value? This is what it says on your wall up front, and bring that back up. And when people are like, oh, yeah, that's a good point. We should be doing this. And so, I mean, you might laugh at it. It's funny, but it worked because, he thought there was a number of things that, the teams weren't following.
And that's the only way values actually make a difference in a company. If they're just on a poster somewhere, that doesn't help. You have to talk about, well, how does this apply to our day-to-day life? How does this apply to how we're doing our work? How does this apply to how we're treating our customer? I love that story.
So what are some of the other ones that you had out there, and how do you
there's one about paying attention to networks, because in many ways that's how change happens in organizations. It happens through webs of connection. And if you can get the people, if you can get the people who are have referent power in your organization on board with what you're doing, your life will be much easier, right? Because networks are hugely influential in organizations. Like if you I don't know if either of you have ever smoked. Have you ever smoked?
No.
No, then you don't know about the smokers network.
No, I don't.
But this hasn't always been true, but when smoking was outlawed in indoor offices, it meant all the smokers had to go congregate outside. And it crossed organizational levels and it crossed departments. And so those people know everything. The smokers know everything, right? So information travels really quickly along those networks. And there's other networks in companies, obviously, the soccer team or the softball team or whatever it is. So if you can figure out who is influential in your organization, in that people respect their opinions and value what they have to say, that makes change a lot easier. And the flip side is that very often changes break networks. These informal webs of relationships that are essential to getting work done. And so you have to pay attention to that too.
Right. Goes back to understanding the awareness of why to change. So I would guess that can be fairly destructive. Like you were talking earlier about just people being complacent isn't the right word, but you're comfortable with the way things are going today. You're comfortable with getting together with other people to smoke break. So if a change is going to be potentially destructive to that, like you need to have a firm understanding of the why of what's in it for me, right? What is life going to look like in 3 months, 6 months from today? if we start to incorporate this change to give me some desire to actually start moving forward with it.
Well, and sometimes there isn't something to be gained. Sometimes it's pure loss, at least in the near term. And I think that's another thing that really gets overlooked in change, is that very often change involves a loss. Change, it may be status, it may be your sense of competence, it may be your sense that, I have an important part to play here. It can be routine, all of those are losses. And that's part of why people hold on.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of it. So, and that goes to the another one of the rules, which is honor the past and the people, right?
So that's interesting. What do you expand on that a little bit, if you don't mind? What do you mean by honoring the past?
I think it's really important to acknowledge that there are good things that happened up until now, and many of them are worth saving, right? Knowing what you want to keep in addition to what you want to change, and not treating people like you've been living in darkness because you aren't doing the Agile, which I see happen a lot, right? Because people were doing the best they could with what they knew, and it's probably a process that was imposed on them by some previous person. So I think it's really important just to acknowledge that people are smart and people are doing the best they can, and they've got good intentions, and there's stuff worth saving, right?
Yeah,
Because people will change to save stuff they value.
yeah. I've had I've come in after other agile coaches or consulting companies have come in, and maybe I didn't agree with all their things, but you have to respect that and say, well, there was a reason they chose to do it this way. Like, what was that reason, and what did we learn from that? And I think, respecting that past is really important, because you're right. You can turn a lot of people off, and sometimes it's those people in those networks that are really influential, and that can really hurt your change.
Yeah. Well, that's another aspect of change. I think that paying attention to how much change people have been through. My friend Jerry Weinberg used to tell this story about a company he went to consult with, who it looked like there was one guy who was trying to sabotage everything they were doing. And he just couldn't quite figure out what was going on. And eventually he went and talked to the guy, and he said, I'm trying to make sense of what you're doing. And it really, the only thing I can figure out is that you're trying to sabotage what we're trying to accomplish here. And the guy said, well, yes, I am. Because our senior leadership brings in a new consulting group every 6 months, and they change everything we're doing, and we never get ahead. We just can't get anything done. So I'm trying to stop the change so that we can just do our work and get something done. And then that led to an interesting conversation, and that led to some differences in how they were going about that. But so if you're dealing with what the previous consultant did and changing it, that sometimes can just feel like churn to people. Yeah. And like, well, this too shall pass.
Yep.
This will go away. This will fade into the distance.
I think that's a good story there about just having a courageous conversation, being open with somebody, and what I guess what's the worst that's going to happen, right? I think there's so many easy barriers that we put in place to just not go and have that conversation. I even think about my day-to-day with, I joke with Jeff about this. Like, I don't have any kids of my own because I'm allergic, but I've got my niece who's living with us now, and I'm her legal guardian. She's my ward. I always get that confused. Anyway, she's 19, and I'm not so great at like being with kids. Now she's 19, but she's from India, different culture, etc. And so I often beat myself up because I'll get frustrated with her because, she's not doing what I tell her to do. Like, sometimes
she's 19.
I know, bear with me here. But then I'll have to like pause and be like, well, why am I getting frustrated with this? Why am I wasting the energy when I could just go and have a conversation with her, be authentic with her, and she can understand where I'm coming from. I can understand maybe where she's coming from, because not to completely peel back the onion here, but like she just came here in December. She lived in India for the last 19 years of her life. Now she's in a new country. She just went to college for the freshman semester, and now she's stuck at home. She doesn't know anybody here. She only communicates with people over Zoom every once in a while when she's in class. Completely different type of culture, and sometimes I lose sight of that, right? And I'm just like, why? Damn it, won't she just listen to me when I say go outside for a walk or whatever, right? But I think that's just a really nice reminder to just go have that courageous conversation.
Well, and look at all the changes she's gone through.
Right.
Right. I mean, she transitioned from probably a much more structured school system, a different culture, a different country, a different climate. I'm betting, are you in Milwaukee or Madison?
Milwaukee.
See, I'm guessing Milwaukee is a different climate than
A little bit.
Just huge changes. I mean, that young woman is probably in chaos.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. I mean, she is trying to figure everything out, and not on top of that, her expectations of what college life might be like were changed, pulled out from under her. So she's going through enormous change.
Mm-hmm. And she has that change fatigue. So it's like, well, let's meet you where you are, right? Like with any change, and step through it together. That'd be my approach. Hardest, I know it's hard, Jeff. That's
yeah.
With your
parental counseling here, but I just thought it was a good example of even going back to your story. Like we just sometimes we avoid the hard conversation, but that's the thing that is going to solve the problem is the hard conversation. And until we have the courage to go and do it, the openness, the authenticity, we're likely just going to be stuck in those systems like you were just talking about before, thinking what holds the patterns in place, right? Well, the pattern right now is I don't go and have that conversation with her. So then I stay frustrated and et cetera. So I was just kind of thinking about that as you were talking about it earlier.
Well, one of the other things I talk about in this book is empathy. Mm-hmm. And that's another thing to bring to those difficult conversations. What's that? And we think about empathy as like emotional empathy, like I have to, understand what they're feeling. Well, that's part of it. But the other part is, understanding their point of view and understanding how they think about things. Mm-hmm. And that helps with those difficult conversations.
Mm-hmm. And a common pattern that I see with a lot of clients is I'm going to go have that hard conversation over email or Slack or something like that. And it's like, oh, no, go talk to the person. Don't go talk to their colleague. Don't go talk to the product owner. Like, just go talk to the person you're having a problem with. Like, I don't know how often I give that advice, but it's a lot, it feels like, So that's another nudge out there for people. Like, have the direct conversation. Don't pull other people in. Like, and have that empathy when you talk with them.
Right. And don't go in with a preconceived notion of what someone's motivation is, mm-hmm. Right? Because we tend to make up stories about people's intentions, mm-hmm. Right? Versus being curious about why would they have done this? Right? Mm-hmm. Oh, they did it because So I think that's a super important thing to do. Is just be clear that whatever you think their intentions are, it's a story you made up in your head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like that. Another good friend of ours and coach, Conrad, would always remind me to assume positive intent in people, right? No, and I always make the joke, right? Nobody wakes up in the morning, steeples their fingers, and wonders, "Ooh, how can I screw with somebody today?" Right?
I think there might be one or two.
Maybe one or two, but it's really unlikely that it's the person you're thinking about, right? And just assume that they're trying to do something with love in their heart, right? They're trying to make a positive impact on things. You might not see it that way, but that's likely the position that they're trying to come in with. Yeah. So I really like that, the empathy and assuming positive intent. And what you were just saying there at the end, like the story that you've made up in your head is made up in your head, right? Just remember that before you enter into that conversation.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I've stole this from Brene Brown is like, because I do this with my wife, and I always have to stop and say, well, okay, this is a story I'm telling myself. And I tell like my wife these stories. Sometimes I do that with clients too. And then they're like, whoa, that's not at all what I was intending or meaning. And I'm like, okay, paint me a picture of what you did mean. And I think those couple phrases really help paint me a picture and here's a story I'm telling myself, like, help me out here.
I think
can be
those
really.
are great.
Yeah.
Yeah, just acknowledging, this is the story I have in my head, and then someone can say, well, no, that's not quite right, and correct.
Mhm.
And then you have a whole different set of feelings, and then you have a whole different set of responses.
Mhm.
That's super. That's great. I love that.
Yeah, you made me think of this other tweet that I saw this week. Todd Miller posted it after one of his courses, and he was talking about how someone made the point in his classes that the word listen and silence have the same letters in them. They're just rearranged in different order. So when you ask that question, listening and be silent.
And try to silence the little voice inside your head too.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, as you were just talking about that, Jeff, I was thinking about how really it's just a forcing function for you to inspect and adapt, and having that opportunity to just pause and reflect on what's going on. I really like that. I was just literally in a PSF course earlier this week for some of our teams in India. And so I was waking up at 3:30 in the morning and then teaching, and it was kind of nice. I was done with the day by noon, but when you normally don't wake up until 8:30 in the morning, it's a little bit different. But we were talking through all those events, and the purpose is to have formal opportunities to inspect and adapt, and being more specific around what you should be looking at during each one of those events. And just tying this back to what you were just talking about, Jeff, was maybe, and speaking only personally here, but maybe I just need more more formal spots to just pause and reflect and just say, hey, what's going on at this point in time? Why am I feeling that way? And okay, am I okay with that? How can I continue moving forward? So I'd like that. Maybe just who knows? Maybe I think actually I heard this idea. Somebody had it's a random timer on your phone, and you turn it on, and it will pick a time anywhere between 30 minutes and 2 hours or something like that, and it just randomly generates a timer, and then it pops up and reminds you. And maybe I think it was for like tracking migraines or something like that, but kind of a neat idea to just a reminder for yourself to just stop and pause. Hey, what am I thinking right now? How am I feeling? And is this an opportunity for me to inspect and adapt and continue moving forward?
I really like that as a way for people to enter into checking out a conversation or checking out, the story you've told yourself. Because
Mm-hmm.
this is kind of a generalization. It's not kind of, it just is that people in our profession generally are not of the touchy feely persuasion. You don't go talk to people about their emotions and being emotionally clear and emotionally intelligent and all that stuff. But if you talk about it as, no, maybe you should inspect and adapt that interaction. I wonder if that would make it easy. It would give people a way to language it that makes it feel not so emotionally vulnerable. Oh, we're just inspecting and adapting our conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so
Oh,
I know when I'm coaching at organizations, like a lot of times, after you've kind of got things started, I'm coaching through product owners, scrum masters, leaders. And like after we have a meeting, I usually try to schedule 5 minutes of like, okay, let's talk meta level. What happened? And like, that's an inspection and adaptation point. I think that's really a valuable thing for
absolutely.
anybody to do. Like, but I'm like guiding them through it, as we kind of are going in the engagement and stuff, and to help them see nuances in the minor things we're doing every single day, every single hour, every single minute.
I like that. That's great.
Mm-hmm. All right. So Esther, I want to ask you about, we were talking before we started about making workplaces more humane, and my company's humane consulting. And so that's really, something I'm passionate about as well as you. So I have to ask, like, how do you do that? Like, what are some of the approaches you take to help workplaces be more humane?
Well, I start by the way I interact with people, right?
Mm-hmm.
I start, from a place of respect and trying to be very curious about the humans I'm working with. And that can have a local impact. And many of the processes and accounting mechanisms in organizations are deeply inhumane,
Mm-hmm.
deeply, deeply inhumane. So I don't always have the scope of influence to change those, and some of them are in our generally accepting accounting practices, so they're not going to change, probably in my lifetime. But I start with the one-on-one interactions, and then if I can, I start working on some of the policies that are dehumanizing or infantilizing.
Mm-hmm.
What out of curiosity, what do you think a few of those would be?
Well, I think ranking systems are dehumanizing. Treating people as fungible is dehumanizing. Just changing the languaging around resources
Mm-hmm.
can make a difference.
It's like nails on a chalkboard for me every time I say, well, we got to move these resources from A to B. And it's like, oh, ouch, it hurts me. Yeah, you mean people?
People. Well, it's just because our words create worlds, right? So the resource, talking about people as resources leads us to think about people as resources, which are fungible, which don't have emotions, which don't have needs. They are just they're expendable in many cases. So that's another place I try to change it.
Mm-hmm.
I look at the metaphors people are using and see if I can shift some of the metaphors. If they're using a lot of war metaphors, I try to shift those.
Yeah, I think those are good ones. I like to think also look at like the language people use, like if it's I, me language, then can we use we, us, and what's in our way from using that type of language? Why don't we feel like it's a we and an us, and dig into that with teams as well.
So why did you choose that name for your company? I'm curious.
Well, I don't know. I've had some days working on waterfall projects where it was pretty rough and, working crazy hours and doing some things that I didn't feel were very humane, like I actually have that experience where it's the CIO's birthday and we need to hit a date because of that. And, like that's, I don't know, those were some tough days and I didn't know any better way of working. And when I found Scrum and Agile, and I was like, oh, this is actually like the way I want to work, and this actually like lets me contribute my best skills. I thought just was a better way to working, and I wanted to share that with more and more people. And so that's just been something that I've always been motivated to do. Is like, there's a better way to build products, and it's better for the people and it's better products that get developed out of it. And so it's just like, it's why I do what I do and why I kind of got into coaching in the first place.
Yeah. So a few years ago, I came across some research by a scholar named Caitlin Rosenthal. And she's a historian of business. I believe that is what her specialty is. I'm not 100% sure, but she was researching something about accounting, and it somehow led her to the account books from slave plantations where there was enslaved labor. And those two things are usually kept pretty separately because that's a history of slavery and agriculture versus business. But what she discovered is that many of the modern accounting practices have that in their family tree. I mean, that's when they really started looking at productivity accounting and creating factory-like efficiencies with human labor, and that's in the family tree, right?
Mm-hmm.
For the accounting practices we have now and the productivity thinking we have now, deeply inhumane.
Yeah, definitely.
So she eventually published her research in a book called Accounting for Slavery.
Huh. I'll have to check that out.
It's not an easy read.
No, very accounting focused.
Well, it's not an easy read because of the brutality.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but it's also, I mean, reading account books is not my favorite thing.
Well, I think we're getting close to our time box, Esther, and I really appreciate this conversation, the deep dives into many different topics. I was informative, and I always learn so much when we get to have great people like you on the podcast. So thank you for joining us. Is there anything you would like to plug at this time? I know we talked to you about your book, but is there anything else that you would like to promote?
Well, I actually have an online course based on this. So I'm starting the fall cohort coming up in October, mid-October. So it's a combination of asynchronous learning and then live video sessions. So that's fantastic. It's the third cohort I've run. You can find out about that on my website, estherderby.com. And I'm doing a series of free webinars for the fall, so people can check those out on my webinar on my website too.
Awesome.